right, thank you guys so much for tuning in again. This will be my second video on Jean Gebser's The Ever-Present Origin. I'm thinking of calling this series Seeing Through Gebser. Um, excuse me. Because one, we're seeing through his ideas, through his lens, how he views the world. And two, we're seeing through in the same way that the integral consciousness structure sees through all the other different consciousness structures. The knowledge in this book can allow you to see through your own psyche and the psyche of the masses and how that affects the world. So could be a good idea. So we're starting on page 9. This is the 3 European worlds. I believe this is his attempt to sort of ease us into the consciousness structures, how they differ. What are the 3 European or the 3 European worlds? The unperspective world, the perspectival world, and the aperspectival world, which is not to be confused with unperspectivity or irrationality or anything like that. The unperspectival world spans the time of history from, it's hard to do dates. He even says this. It's hard because the magic and mythical consciousness structures didn't really weren't conducive towards historical documentation, but essentially all the way up until the Renaissance, you had the unperspectival world, which consists of either the magical consciousness structure or the mythical consciousness structure. That is the unperspectival world. Then we get to the perspectival world. Now, what is the key discovery that differentiates these two? That is space. Everything that separates these 3 time epochs, maybe besides the aperspectival world, is a discovery of space. The unperspectival world did not have a differentiated understanding or a high degree of understanding of space. It just simply had not been discovered yet, perspective. Whereas the perspectival world did. And whereas the aperspectival world, what separates that from the unperspective and the perspectival world is the discovery of time, really space-time, which we'll get into maybe in a different video in this series because that's going to be a little more complex. To Gebser, time is not a part of space or anything like that. It is a constituent of space. It helps create space. And we'll get into that later with the aperspectival world. So we're going to be going through 3 worlds. It shouldn't be too much, but this is going to be a little longer, so I'm hoping to just get right into it. I have my notes as I need to read. Now, in accordance, we're just going to read. Again, why not just read Gebser straight out of the devil's mouth? I can pretend to be smart and pretend to be smarter than I am and try to just give you it in my way, but again, I want to give you Gebser, so let's do it. Quote, the transformation of European sensitivity to and comprehension of the world is nowhere more clearly discernible than in painting and architecture. Only our insight into this transformation can lead to a proper understanding of the nature and meaning of new styles and forms of expression. Restricting ourselves here primarily to the art of the Christian era, we can distinguish 2 major self-contained epochs among the many artistic styles, followed today by an incipient third. An incipient means in an initial stage or beginning to happen or develop. The first encompasses the era up to the Renaissance, which is about 1250 AD, 1300 AD, somewhere around there, to the Renaissance. The other, now coming to a close, extends up to the present. The decisive and distinguishing characteristic of these epochs is the respective absence or presence of perspective space. Consequently, we shall designate the first era as the unperspectival, the second as the perspectival, and the currently emerging epoch as the aperspectival. As we shall see, these designations are valid not only with respect to art history, but also to aesthetics, cultural history, and the history of the psyche and the mind. The achievement of perspective indicates man's discovery and consequent coming to awareness of space, whereas the unrealized perspective indicates that space is dormant in man and that he is not yet awakened to it. Moreover, the unperspectival world suggests a state in which man lacks self-identity. He belongs to a unit, such as a tribe or communal group, where the emphasis is not yet on the person, but on the impersonal, not on the I, but on the communal group, the qualitative mode of the collective. So there you go. Space is what separates these worlds, the discovery of space and understanding of space. And it's interesting that he says a state, space, the discovery of these things are in us. It's almost like an entelechy. The acorn comes into existence with the purpose of becoming a tree. The purpose, its goal, is inherent, it's inward, and must be externally actualized in the real world. That seems to be what's happening here. We have all these potentialities and potencies within us that we must discover and deal with them on the inside, discover them on the inside, and project them outside into the external world. Now, he mentioned art in the first paragraph. Now, he mentioned all the other manifestations of human expression, but he mentioned art, and that's probably the best one to start with. Excuse me. If you look at a lot of the art up until the Renaissance, up until the discovery of depth perspective, realistic paintings that are realistic and not just in some fantastical world, what you'll see, well, let's start from the very beginning. You can see cave paintings. Let's say I'm a primitive man and I'm painting on the cave and I'm painting saber-tooths or different animals. All my other fellow tribe members are going to be doing the same. And in doing so, all of our paintings are going to be all on top of one another. There's no sense of perspectivity. There's no sense of proportionality, no sense of realism. Everything's on top of each other. Everything's confused. You have to really kind of sit there and look. Oh, okay, I see. Because it's hard to tell because 5 other guys just kind of squiggled all over your drawing and now I can't tell anything. Space has not been differentiated yet. They don't understand. No, they should be a few inches apart from one another so we can see them and visually clarify them. The one in the foreground should be bigger than the one in the background. They didn't understand that yet. And even when you get into classical religious paintings, God, Jesus, the Egyptian pharaoh, he was proportionally much bigger. He looked like a giant in these paintings because that's who he is symbolically. That's how they viewed him. It's not, they didn't view him as a realistic person. He is a god. So in our paintings, we must upscale his size to represent that superiority that he has over us. So there was no sense of, Jesus looking like a normal human with other proportionally correct humans, at least maybe some with the Christian art, because that's a little different, because Gebser says Christ was the bearer of the mental consciousness structure. So maybe that's not the best example. But the Egyptian pharaohs, for example, they were just bigger because that's what they represented. Let's see. Oh, now I lost mine. Here we go. And he uses art as an example to really go through painting and architecture. I don't think we'll get into architecture, but we might get into painting now. Now here he says, man's lack of spatial awareness is attended by a lack of ego consciousness, since in order to objectify and qualify space, a self-conscious I is required that is able to stand opposite or confront space, as well as to depict or represent it by projecting it out of his soul or psyche. So when this discovery of space happens around the Renaissance, around 1300 AD, 1400 AD, 1500 AD, I'm objectifying the world. That's what's happening. Space is become objectified. And in doing so, there must be a corresponding subject, a corresponding I that can analyze that, the new dimension of the world. Now that's important because that seems to be the reason why you don't see a ton of individual rights, strong I's in governance and monarchy. You might see it in the king, but everything is very communal, everything is very tribal. And I think that's important when you're analyzing history. You should understand that there is a reason why the individualism of our day came about at a certain time, because it's a product of a subject, a strong sense of I. And that I, that strong subject, developed because it had to, or else we wouldn't have been able to understand the newly objectified world of space, rather than the unperspectival world of the magic and mythical consciousness structures, which we'll get into once we get into the specific construct structures. Excuse me. Right. Now, this is interesting because there's a good point, or a good example he makes with geometry. He says, despite, or indeed because of, Euclidean geometry, there is no evidence of an awareness of qualitative and objectified space in early antiquity or in the epoch preceding the Renaissance. So you see this in Euclidean geometry. In Euclidean geometry, it's just 2D flat geometry. So we have a circle, we have a triangle, we have a square, we have 2 points, and a dot. So we're coming up with basic axioms of geometry right angles must equal 90 degrees. A line is a point, 2 points connected by a line, stuff like that. But then, of course, in the Renaissance, the discovery of space, we have three-dimensional. Now it's not just flat; it's the sphere almost. It's a circle with an extra dimension. We can look into it. We're seeing through the circle, which I thought was super, super interesting. Now, another big thing, because space has not quite been discovered yet in the unperspectival world, the cosmology of the world, the way the unperspectival man, human, understood his place in the cosmos was he was in a cave. And there's an important point that Plato breaks out of the cave, right? That's not just a metaphor for enlightenment. That is how they viewed the world. Everything, the cosmology, the earth, was enclosed by this sort of invisible bubble that acted exactly as you are in a cave. You are trapped within this cavern, this dark cavern. Everything is dark. I can't leave. I can't really see that much, but this is my world. When space is discovered and Christopher Columbus discovers the New World, you can see how space is starting to open up. The world as cavern is dying out. So take the sky. The sky would be seen as little more than the ceiling that's above me right now. It's kind of, it looks like the sky, there's stuff out there, and we believe it is because we understand space and all the planets and all stuff, but they didn't have that back then. So they viewed it as the painting on the Sistine Chapel as Michelangelo. It's very pretty, it's very nice, but ultimately it does enclose you into a world. And then of course Columbus discovers the New World. The cavern is being picked apart and all the light is coming through, and we're saying, this isn't a cavern. This isn't a closed cavern. This is an ever all-encompassing, ever-expanding space. And that's why you get Stephen Hawking, I believe, and his idea of space as this sort of progressive balloon where it just continually expands and expands and expands. And there you go. Now, this is important too, because the individualism had not yet quite apotheosized, because it had not quite yet been actualized, reified, or realized, everything was tribal. And this is important because this is where our tribalism comes from. This world, up until the Renaissance, everything was vital. Everything was either emotionally driven or driven by instincts or driven by the imagination and myth. Now, that's fine and that can work. But the problem is there is a strong sense of we. And when that becomes deficient instead of efficient, now we see problems. Now we have tribalism. Now we have genocide. Now we have wars and completely unnecessary conflicts. Now we have racism. Now we have sexism and stuff like that. That's not good. But the tribal we, that's the deficient mode. In its efficient mode, now Gebser hasn't said this, but this is just my own. Well, this is community, right? This is the beauty of humans. This is where we can work together and sacrifice for one another, and in turn improve the lives of each other and ourselves by morally engaging with the community, with the world. It confers meaning, it confers satisfaction, it confers happiness, and it confers a better society. So it's important. The rationalists out there, don't try to rationalize away this aspect of you, and we'll get to that. But the we, the sense of tribal, you cannot outrun it. Gebser says these mutations are irrevocable. Do not try to. Don't try to pretend to stoic your way out of everything. And even then, the Stoics will tell you don't suppress. You have to understand these urges, and once you have knowledge over these urges, you can think, oh, am I falling into this sort of crazed fanaticism of the collective as an emotional response to the hyper individualism in the perspectival world, which brings us to that. Now, the pre-perspectival world started with the ancient Greeks. Gebser says the fascination with the body, I think, brought up the subject where they were constantly just staring at it. Well, they sort of realized this is an individual. This isn't just merely a member of the community or the tribe or the city-state, like in the unperspectival world, all the way up until the Renaissance. That's where, again, all those collectivized urges, and they need to be balanced with the individual urge that is brought in with the perspectival world. Now he says the perspectival world proper starts in 1250 AD in Christian Europe. He says the first renderings of space begin to appear in painting And he later goes on to say that Leonardo da Vinci is the sort of the apotheosis of the perspectival world because he achieved realistic depth perspective in painting, and he also did it in blueprints and technical drawings, which is important. You can, again, like I said in other videos, you cannot have um, blueprints or even an ushering of the technological age, the industrial revolution, without a high degree of understanding of space. It's very important. Now, let's see. Let me get a second. He says, now this is another quote from Gebser. He says, a new psychic awareness of space, objectified or externalized from the psyche out into the world, begins. A consciousness of space whose element of death becomes visible in perspective. The psychic inner space breaks forth at the very moment that the troubadours are writing the first lyric I poems, the first personal poetry that suddenly opens an abyss between man, as poet, and the world or nature. Concurrently, at the University of Paris, Thomas Aquinas, following the thought of his teacher Albertus Magnus, asserts the validity of Aristotle, thereby initiating the rational displacement of the predominantly psychic-bound Platonic world. And this occurred in the wake of Petrus Hispanus, the later Pope John XXI, who had authored the first comprehensive European textbook on psychology. Psychology, individual, me, I. You can't really have personal psychology without an I, an individual. Excuse me. Introducing via Islam in Spain the Aristotelian theory of the soul. Shortly thereafter, Duns Scotus freed theology from the hieratic rigors of scholasticism by teaching the primacy of volition and emotion, and the blindness of antiquity to time inherent in its unperspectival, physically stressed world gave way to the visualization of an openness to time with a quantifiable spatial character. This was exemplified by the erection of the first public clock in the courtyard of Westminster Palace in 1283, an event anticipated by Pope Sabinus, who in 604 ordered the ringing of bells to announce the passing of the hours. So what he's doing here is he's trying to explain, look, it's not just Leonardo, it's not just art, it's not just blueprints. It is a consciousness structure that mutates in all forms of human expression. And it's interesting when you start to notice all these new discoveries that you might not understand specifically how they relate to one another, but you have almost an intuitive feeling that, the advent of reason, the age of enlightenment, the scientific revolution. You might not understand this to the level that Gebser does, but once you start seeing all these new discoveries in a new way, it's almost as if discoveries are being made with a new filter. It's a new filter with which discoveries are being made. That's what these consciousness structures are, and you can pick up on these things if you pay attention. Now, let's get to Petrarch. Petrarch's very important. Now, Petrarch was the first, let's see, he was the first to climb Mount Ventoux, I believe, and he was the one who really discovered perspective. Now, in Petrarch's letter, he wrote a letter as a sort of confession. Remember, he was the first one. He was raised his entire life in the unperspectival world, and then he was the first to discover the perspectival world. Now, this is a big, big, big problem because it causes a seismic crack in the psyche. Imagine, I think a lot of people know the feeling when your entire worldview has been completely undermined. And I'm almost attempting to do that to all you rationalists during this video. That's kind of what I'm attempting you to do. But in a negative way, it can be absolutely life ruinous, truly life ruinous. You could go crazy. You could lose your sense of self. You could start to become some disaffected terrorist or school shooter or something like that. And I think Petrarch had that potential. Let's see. Petrarch's letter, in the nature of a confession, it is addressed to the Augustinian professor of theology who had taught him to treasure and emulate Augustine's confessions. Now, a person makes a confession or an admission only if he believes he has transgressed against something, and it is this vision of space, as extended before him from the mountaintop, this vision of space as a reality, and its overwhelming impression, together with his shock and dismay, his bewilderment at his perception and acceptance of the panorama, that are reflected in his letter. It marks him as the first European to step out of the transcendental gilt ground of the Siena masters, the first to emerge from a space dormant in time and soul into, quote, real space, where he discovers landscape. He says this is very important. When Petrarch's glance, so he's standing on top of Mount Ventoux, you fucking snobby French people, and he looks out above the mountain and he hits him like a bolt of lightning. Everything is isolated from each other. Now, before that, everything was unified. Everything was either man and world or just world to which man belonged. Everything was unified. Not so much with the discovery of space. Everything is realistic, which means it's different from each other now. He said, when Petrarch's glance spatially isolated a part of quote unquote nature from the whole, the all encompassing attachment to sky and earth and the unquestioned, closed, unperspectival ties are severed. The isolated part becomes a piece of land created by his perception. He has a new way of perceiving on Wednesday what he perceived in the unperspectival way on Tuesday. The isolating, when he stands on top of the mountain, he says, there's a tree over there, and there's a rock over there, and there's a farm, and there's another tree, and then there's another mountain. This separation, now me, you, and I, we view this as just normal. This is how the world operates, of course. As a matter of fact, if we were to start spitting the unified theory of life, they would call me schizophrenic, which I'll get to. This sectoring, this isolating individual components into the world onto itself, so it is different from other isolated components, and we then analyze and confer synthetic unity and see, which is just fancy word for saying how do these operate and connect with one another. But this separation is created by perception. It's a new consciousness structure, a new way of bringing objects in the world into relation with each other. Now, let's get it. He said the old world where only the soul is wonderful, quote, the old world, where only the soul is wonderful and worthy of contemplation, as expressed succinctly in Augustine's words, time resides in the soul, now begins to collapse. There is a gradual but an increasingly evident shift from time to space until the soul wastes away in the materialism of the 19th century. A loss obvious to most people today, only the most recent generations have begun to counter in new ways. Shit, I think I read the wrong one. All right, let's see. He was the one, Petrarch was the one to discover space, perspective, around the Renaissance. And now he goes on, that's right. He said, the event that Petrarch describes in almost prophetic terms as, quote, certainly of benefit to himself and many others, unquote, inaugurates a new realistic, individualistic, and rational understanding of nature. And he goes on in art, he mentions Giotto, Fra Angelico, Ambrogio Lorenzetti. These are also people who discovered space at the same time. And then he says, quote, all of these manifestations arose as genuine artistic expressions and direct, that is, unreflected utterances of the change in man's attitude toward the world. Not until the third decade of the 15th century did European man begin to reflect and theorize, that is, consciously come to terms with the possibilities and expressive forms of the new style. This is when mental, rational concepts start to come in. This is when the structure begins to actually take root and be realized properly. Now, he also wants to make a point that he says even the minor masters in art, and again, this can be expressed in all forms of human expression, the leap, in this case, from the unperspectival consciousness structures, the magic and mythical, to the mental, the rational consciousness structures, it's very, 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 very difficult to make. And it usually creates a huge problem where it introduces psychological turbulence, it introduces confusion, anxiety is a big one because people don't really know what's going on, all they know is things are changing. And unfortunately, it usually creates a dark age. And I think when you see the shifts and you see it takes hundreds of years sometimes for everyone to get on board and so much toil and pain, it's a little disheartening, but this is why it's so important to get the word out there. It doesn't have to be this much of a struggle if we are conscious and knowledgeable of what is happening to us. Now, this is okay. Now, this is interesting. Now, this isn't quite a huge point. This is almost incidental, but this is very interesting. He said, the ultimate achievement of perspectivity is the aerial perspective of Leonardo's Last Supper. Okay, that's right. Now listen to this. This is interesting. Before returning to Leonardo, we must mention two facts which demonstrate better than any description the extent of fascination with the problem of perspective during the later part of the 15th century when perspective becomes virtually normative. In his Divina Proporzione, Luca Pacioli, excuse me, celebrated perspective as the eighth art. So again, this is important how the reverence they're assigning to this new way of viewing the world. And when Antonio del, I'm not even going to try, built a memorial to perspective on one of his papal tombs in St. Peter's some 10 years later in the 1490s, he boldly added perspective as the eighth free art to the other seven. He says, at the risk of exasperating many readers, we would venture to point out that this supersession of the number seven, the heptaus, can be interpreted as an indication of the symbolic conquest of the cavernous and vaulted heaven of unperspectivity. The cavern is being picked at, it's being torn apart. We're getting out of it, light's coming through. With the arrival of the eighth quote unquote art, which can also be considered an eighth muse, the world of the ancient seven planet heaven collapses. The previous cosmology that was not realistic, that was not scientific, that was mythical or magical, seven planets upheld the cosmology into the cavern like world. That's beginning to go as perspective has been discovered. Let's see. The world of the ancient seven planet heaven collapses. The quote unquote N, the negation retained in the night sky, Nacht, of the unperspectival cavern gives way to the clarity and diurnal brightness of the eight, Acht, which lacks the negating N. The heptagonal cosmos of the ancients and its mystery religions are left behind, and man steps forth to integrate and concretize space. I think that is fascinating. So we have EIGHT, and then we have NIGHT. Now, night means that the N, and the N negates. In this case, it's negating light, which would negate further illumination or understanding. But then it switches to eight. And remember, the eight is important because it's one after seven. So it collapses the seven, and it no longer has that negating N. And this is the same principle that's being expressed when Columbus burst past the bounds of the unperspectival world and discovers what would later be America. He is no longer negated, and that is also expressed even just verbally or etymologically in eight and night, which I think is it's interesting. It's not the whole point, but I think it's fascinating personally. All right, now we're going to read a little bit more Gebser. Shocker. Quote, we have noted that perspective is the preeminent expression of the emergent consciousness of 15th century European man, the palpable expression of his objectivation of spatial awareness. Besides illuminating space, perspective brings it to man's awareness and lends man his own visibility of himself. Again, the subject is coming up, the I, the me. This is the fundamental fuel that fuels America, Western civilization. I, individual, I am sectored off from the community, from the tribe, and you will confer rights upon me, or God is that I will entrust upon you. Big, 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 big. Yet this very same perspective, whose study and gradual acquisition were a major preoccupation for Renaissance man, not only extends his image of the world by achieving specialization, but also narrows his vision, a consequence that still afflicts us today. So yes, technically, we have expanded our vision, take Columbus as I just said, but because rationality is limited and what is consciously known and what can be quantifiably measurable, we are discovering more and more of the world, but we're also sectoring off more and more of the unknown, because the more and more that we know, we don't really know. We only know in part because we're working with a limited way of bringing objects in the world into relation with each other. Now, this is very important. He says, perspectival vision and thought confine us within spatial limitations. Elsewhere, we have alluded to the antithesis inherent in perspective. It locates and determines the observer as well as the observed. So the dualistic binaries that are super important to rational thought, which we'll get into more later in the series when we get into the mental consciousness structure. So don't worry if you're a little confused. We'll be explaining more deeply. This is just easing us in. It's inherent in the subject-object antithesis. They are dualistic, one binary, the other. They confer meaning by what they're not, and that's inherent in everything. The positive result is a concretion of man in space, a realistic understanding of space and the world, scientific understanding. The negative result is the restriction of man to a limited segment where he perceives only one sector of reality, that which comports with rationality. Like Petrarch, who separated landscape from land, man separates from the whole only that part which his view or thinking can encompass, and forgets those sectors that lie adjacent, beyond, or even behind. One result is the anthropocentrism that has displaced what we might call the theocentrism previously held. Man, himself a part of the world, endows his sector of awareness with primacy, but he is, of course, only able to perceive a partial view. The sector is given prominence over the circle. The part outweighs the whole. As the whole cannot be approached from a perspectival attitude to the world, we merely superimpose the character of wholeness onto the sector, the result being familiar totality. And that right there, my friends, is the problem with the perspectival world. It is fundamentally limited. So let's pretend we're Petrarch again. I'm on the mountain. I'm looking out my window. Look at all these trees. That's awesome. So I have the whole, and I'm sectoring off parts of it and then analyzing how they function and relate to one another. In doing so, I don't actually have the whole. I have the whole that can be visually encompassed, and I'm missing what is adjacent, behind, and beneath the whole. So if I'm on top of the mountain, I see, again, farm over there, trees over there, mountain over there, rock over there, people over there. I have the whole. I don't have the whole. I have the whole only of which I can visually encompass and see and clarify. I am missing everything else. And the problem is that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if we didn't transpose the whole onto the part. The problem is I just assume that everything I can see is the whole. It's not. It's never been the whole. It never will be the whole. Fundamentally limited perspective. I will be explaining this in more detail once we get to the mental consciousness structure, but the same problems with rational thought are the same problems with Petrarch's visual understanding of the world. In the same way that Petrarch considers whole all of which he can visually encompass, rationality considers whole all which can be encompassed by rational thought, which is fundamentally one-sided and that which is qualitatively measurable, or excuse me, quantitatively measurable and consciously known. Anything else it skews as not important, either doesn't exist, shouldn't exist, and the only thing that should is what can fit in my rational, limited perspective. It's destructive, but we'll get to that. You have to understand that. It's very, 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 very important. Let's see. And you can see this. We'll give some examples, right? So because, let's take the subconscious, the contents of the subconscious. Sometimes they come through dreams. They're symbols that open themselves to a wide variety of interpretations. Sometimes some may even, rational thought may be considered contradictory. Because I cannot quantifiably measure contents of the subconscious or even see the subconscious on a brain scan, the rationalists, and they can pay lip service to it, but they privilege what is consciously known and they eschew the unconscious. And in doing so, does anyone think that's a good idea? The unconscious seems to dominate our life. It's really not even the unconscious, it's just the whole conscious. But nonetheless, in rational terms, the unconscious dominates our life. But in constantly privileging what is consciously known, we're staying in the world of the ego, the consciously me, the conscious I, the conscious sense of me here. That's a big problem because now we're slaves and dependent upon our essentially the aspects of the other consciousness structures, the mythical and the magical, the emotions, the imaginations, the vitalist urges, the succumbing to the emotional self when you get so emotional that a new person seems to come about where you're just like, well, rationality has difficulty accounting for that, and so it just doesn't deal with it. I guess they just plan on just being a slave to it, I guess. um, what else? Spiritual world. This is a big one. Um, because the atheist cannot quantifiably measure the soul, which is inherently immeasurable. Anytime you think you have a rational understanding of the soul, you don't, and you should stop right there. It is by definition immeasurable. Why can't I see the spirits? I can't see them, so I guess they don't exist? No, just because they aren't quantifiably measurable, and just because you can't account for them for your fundamentally limited perspective, doesn't mean I'm going to pretend that they don't exist. They do exist. This is another one. Free will versus determinism. It's real easy to pretend we're all determined robots if you only look at physical causes that show up on a brain scan. The contents when you invoke the metaphysical faculties of memory and the ability to imagine fictions, in which memory, when I pick up these papers, I can stop and say, oh, what happened last time did I pick up these papers? Oh, I got a paper cut. Oh, I dropped them and they went in the trash can. Oh, nothing happened. I just put them right down. That gives me room to pause and gives me freedom, and then the ability to imagine fictions. I can do something new, that I'm no longer confined within just the strict spatial limitations of rational thought or just the thoughts of people in my culture. So we do have free will. Determinism is stupid. It is dumb. It can only be defended rationalism, under rationalism, and that's a big problem. Now he says, we're going to read a little more. He says, quote, perspective provides a distance between man and objects. Such detachment is always a sign of an emergent objectifying conscious and of a liberation of previously innate potentialities that are subsequently rediscovered and realized in the outer world. Now, what did I just say? We have the conscious and the subconscious. We have the conscious ego versus the sub or unconscious. There's a space here. There's a antithetical aspect. Again, the space is in between the binaries. That is perspectival rational thought. So that's a problem. That's a problem with rationalism. It rationalizes away all the images, symbols, and myths that are designed to carry the spirit forward. As a matter of fact, they would scoff at me even saying the word spirit, because that's, again, that's this sort of vague gesturing at this amorphous, I don't care. That's your problem. That's not mine. You're the one with the limited perspective. I just explained it, and I'll explain it more later in this series, but we need to kill rationalism. I don't like it. Let's see. Such detachment is always a sign of an emergent objectifying consciousness and of liberation of previously innate potentialities that are subsequently rediscovered and realized in the outer world. This example again suggests to what extent perspective is the most tangible expression of an entire epoch. The basic concern of perspective, which it achieves, is to, quote, look through space and thereby to perceive and grasp space rationally. That is what it is. Let's see. Now, of course, rationality, rational thought ushers in what? Scientific revolution, 3D geometrical revolution, arguably psychology, which is kind of an attempt to quantifiably measure the qualitative evaluations or just aspects of our internal self that are difficult to quantifiably measure. That's a big problem with modern psychology. And then, of course, the Industrial Revolution. Now, again, rational thought is great when kept moderated and kept in its place. When we're in areas of science, when we're in areas of statistics or just measuring something, history, it's important as long as you recognize that there are limitations and you don't subsume all other aspects of the human condition and the world into that. We're going to be fine. If you keep it in its place, keep it moderated, we're going to be fine. Okay? But the rationalists don't do that. It's immoderated. They take it way too far. And I would argue that's the problem with all our world. And I recorded 2 videos out of order attacking rationalism because it pissed me off so much. Now, at the risk of beating a dead horse, I want to read a little bit of all the other discoveries that are happening on this time. I've already kind of talked about this, so we won't talk about it too much. Now he says, space is the quote, space is the insistent concern of this era. In underscoring this assertion, we have relied only on the testimony of its most vivid manifestation, the discovery of perspective. We did, however, mention in passing that at the very moment when Leonardo discovered space and solved the problem of perspective, thereby creating the possibility for spatial objectification in painting, other events occur which parallel his discovery. Copernicus, for example, shatters the limits of the geocentric sky and discovers heliocentric space. Columbus goes beyond the encompassing Oceanos and discovers Earth space. Vesalius, the first major anatomist, bursts the confines of Galen's ancient doctrines of the human body and discovers the body's space. Harvey destroys the precepts of Hippocrates, humoral medicine, and reveals the circulatory system. And there is Kepler, who by demonstrating the elliptical orbit of the planets overthrows antiquity's unperspectival world image of circular and flat surfaces, a view still held by Copernicus, that dated back to Ptolemy's conception of the circular movement of the planets. So again, it's not just space, not just blueprints. It is everything. It is all forms of human expression. It's an epoch, and just like all the preceding epochs, it has efficient aspects and deficient aspects. Right now, we are way lost in the deficient of the mental consciousness structure, rational thought. All right, well, let's see. We got a few more quotes here. Now, this next one is going to be a bit of a long one, but it's gold, so we're all good. Let's see where I want to start. The overemphasis on space and spatiality that increases with every century since 1500 is at once the greatness as well as the weakness of perspectival man. His overemphasis on the quote-unquote objectively external, a consequence of an excessively visual orientation, leads not only to rationalization and haptification, but to an unavoidable hypertrophy of the eye, which is essentially just an exaggeration. Egotism, which is in confrontation with the external world. This exaggeration of the I amounts to what we may call an ego hypertrophy. The I must be increasingly emphasized, indeed overemphasized, in order for it to be adequate to the ever-expanding discovery of space. At the same time, the increasing materialization and haptification of space, which confronts the ego, occasions a corresponding rigidification of the ego itself. The expansion of space brings on the gradual expansion and consequent disintegration of the I on the one hand, preparing favorable circumstances for collectivism. On the other hand, the haptification of space rigidifies and encapsulates the I, with the resultant possibility of isolation evident in egocentrism. Now, as I said, America, particularly America, but Western civilization will say, was fueled by the mental consciousness structure. So the I, the hypertrophy, as Gebser calls it, the exaggeration of the I, the self, the individual, this is manifest in many different forms. Liberalism, as I alluded to earlier, individual rights. I have been separated from just mere cog of the tribe. I have my own rights. You are not to violate those rights. We also see this in capitalism, which I love. I'm a show for capitalism. The individual has the most knowledge, interest, and experience in their circumstances, in what they want, their money, how they should spend their money. So they are privileged in making those decisions, discernments. They get to be the ones who decide to what they buy, what they want, because they have the most knowledge, interest, and experience. The general libertarian culture of America, the liberalism itself, which takes considerations of from the unperspectival worlds that caused wars, particularly World War II. So, or I guess before then, tribal ideas, ethnos, national identities, theological conflicts, religious conflicts, philosophical conflicts. It tries to take all that, shove it in a little broom closet in the back, and say, no, we're going to have rational arguments in a neutral marketplace of ideas, and the friend-enemy distinction that is so essential to politics dissipates entirely. We don't want friend enemies. We want friends who disagree with one another. That is, I think, a manifestation of this hypertrophy of the I. Now, in its efficient phase, it's amazing. And I love America. The problem is we're in its deficient phase, where it's become too far. It's stretched too far. Now, any good, Aristotle showed us this, any good stretched too far becomes a bad. Even if I were to grant you that rationality is a good, which I do believe it is, any good stretched too far becomes a bad. Take food, for example. Food is undeniably good. We simply would not exist without it. What happens if you eat too much food in one sitting? Truly too much food? You will die. You will die. That is the lesson. All you economics people should understand this very, very quickly. Now, and of course, so when he talks about the rigidification of the I, as we're rationally understanding the world now, the objectified spatial world, the ego becomes hardened and consolidated and rigidifies. And combined with liberalism, combined with this eschewing of collective identities, national identities, and any sort of collective, that's what he says. You are furnishing the preconditions for collectivism. There's bad collectivism, communism, Nazism, stuff like that. You have these, you will always have these terrible manifestations of, or terrible political systems or parties because you have thrown off the balance between the I, the me, and the group. This is what the integral consciousness structure is trying to rebuild. You focused way too much on the I. People have become sectored off and divided. They don't feel connected to the tribe, which is way more powerful than the idea of the individual. Remember, the unperspectival world went from all the way up until the Renaissance. Renaissance is 600 years ago. That's nothing. The unperspectival world was hundreds of thousands of years. So that's a very powerful urn. That's a big problem you're seeing in American politics right now. No one can agree on anything. We're also divided into sectors. We can't do anything because we're relying way too much on rationality. As to the perspectival attitude, it is thus possible to maintain that the domination of space which results from an extreme perspectivation upsets and unbalances the I. In addition, the one-sided emphasis on space, which has its extreme expression in materialism and naturalism, consumerism, that's another big one, gives rise to an ever greater and conscious feeling of guilt about time, the neglected component of our manifest world. So a big problem is another big problem, and I'll get into this later in the series because I'm actually just learning it now. I'm on around page 200. It has a way of viewing time as if it's a spatial container. I have to fill time. I have to kill time. Oh, my beautiful girlfriend. I have to fill time. I have to kill time. I have to spend time. I have to. It's as if it's some object that's being held, or this water bottle, and I'm filling it with water. That's not what it is at all. Gebser has a more integral understanding of time. What it does is it breaks time into past, future. We have past, future, present. When we get to the mental conscious structure, we'll get into the triangular thought here. And we exist, as Aristotle said, as this sort of in between of a dying past and a beginning future. Gebser eschews that. He says this is deficient rationalism. You're not treating time as a unique problem on its own. You're just viewing it as a space, and it's not. What else? Let's see. Although although man's horizon expanded, his world became increasingly narrow as his vision was sectorized by the blinders of the perspectival worldview. The gradual movement toward clearer vision was accompanied by a proportionate narrowing of his visual sector. We are only focusing on what my visual sector can encompass. That's a big problem. The deeper and farther we extend our view into space, the narrower is the sector of our visual pyramid. So yes, we are making more and more discoveries, and in doing so, we are precluding the possibility of other discoveries or different ways in which we view objects in the world. As it developed over the centuries, this state of affairs gave rise to the most destructive of the stigmas of our age, the universal intolerance that prevails today, and the fanaticism to which it leads. A person who is anxious, or who is fleeing from something, or who is lost either with respect to his own ego or with respect to the world, it holds equally true in both instances, is a person who will always be intolerant as he feels threatened in his vital interests. The dogmatism did not go away. So when the atheists, and I'm not a super Christian, I'm not a Christian at all, I'm not a religious person at all. When the atheists tell you that only these irrational Muslim or Christian believers are the only ones capable of dogmatism, that's just not true. The either or conception of the either or way in which objects in the world are brought into relation with each other in the rational conscious structure, that's dogmatic. It creates a world of adherents and a world of idiots who don't dare to believe what is objectively true. The dogmatism is still there. He, quote, sees only a vanishing point lost in the misty distance, and he feels obliged to defend his point fanatically, lest he lose the world entirely. Again, you have to have that dogmatism, because then if you don't, it will introduce psychological turbulence and chaos. That's a big problem. The European of today, and of course this was released in 1949, directly off of World War II, either as an individual or as a member of the collective, can perceive only his own sector. This is true of all spheres, the religious as well as the political, the social as well as the scientific. The rise of Protestantism fragmented religion. The ascendancy of national states divided the Christian Occident into separate individual states. The rise of political parties divided the people into political interest groups. In the sciences, this process of segmentation led to the contemporary state of narrow specialization and the quote-unquote great achievements of the man with tunnel vision. And there is no quote-unquote going back. The ties to the past, the religio, are almost non-existent, having been severed, as it were, by the cutting edge of the visual pyramid. As for the simple onward progression and continuity, which has almost taken on the character of a flight, they lead only to further sectors of particularization and ultimately to atomization. After that, what remains like what was left in the crater of Hiroshima is only an amorphous dust, and it is probable that at least one part of humanity will follow this path, at least in quote unquote spirit, i.e., psychologically. So we've taken the whole, we've sectored, we've divided, which is a fundamental aspect of rational thought, the way it brings objects in the world into relation with each other, and we've done so. And what do we get? We get Hiroshima. We get the atom bomb. And now everyone's got bombs. On the physical world, it's destroyed, or at least it's created the potential to truly destroy the entire world and irrevocably, in a singularity event, destroy humanity. Awesome, awesome, love that. Glad we're in the age of progress and reason. I'm so glad that we're all listening to the rationalists. And then on the metaphysical world, as like you said, it leads to psychological atomization. We see this atomization means everything exactly that. We're splitting and splitting so much to the point we can't confer unity on everything, and that just leads to chaos and an emotional reaction, which is never going to be good. So we see this in skepticism, existentialism, and I would argue postmodernity. Um, the internal, after all the external world has been divided and sectored off, even politically, if not just scientifically, liberalism, after it beat out Nazism and communism, well, it said, well, we got nothing else to fight, so we're going to go inward. And then we get postmodernity, where our epistemological faculties, which is just a fancy word, excuse me, for the study of knowledge, what it means to know, how do we know things, have been deconstructed as well. We've deconstructed everything. And what are we doing when we deconstruct? When I watch Alex O'Connor video and he says Jordan Peterson deconstructed, what is he doing? He's taking the whole of his statements, he's dividing it, he's sectoring off parts of his statements, and he's seeing if they are true in accordance with reason. It's become immoderated, it's gone way too far, and it's led to complete disaster, both physically and metaphysically. And we're dealing with the problems of that in America. No one agrees on everything. People people don't even agree that anything can be true. They're all postmodernists. They think all of this is just power. It's absurd. And I think it's important to invoke Peter Sloterdijk in his Spheres trilogy when he said, say what you will about the magical and mythical consciousness structure, the unperspectival world. What that world was, it created this, like I said, the cavern. Now, the cavern enclosed and protected, and it's the same thing with their religious narratives and mythology. It created a metaphorical, a metaphorical womb, and inside that womb was the civilization, and that womb conferred health, myth, and meaning, and it was made of myth and meaning, which conferred purpose, psychological contentment. It tempered tribalistic and violent urges, and it united a people. That's what religion does. It's a cultural immune system. And starting with Nietzsche, or I guess Darwin, Nietzsche, Marx, and starting all the way with the atheists, they picked at that. I think Spengler says it's like an egg. So imagine the egg, and inside that egg is a civilization, and the egg allows the civilization to live and be healthy and be successful and defend itself from incursions from hostile ideologies or the realities of the world, death, famine, disease, stuff like that. That's the point of a cultural immune system. It unites, hopefully, and protects and assigns meaning, moral codes, all that stuff. The problem is that's gone now. And Western civilization is completely unprotected. And the individualism, the hypertrophy, the exaggeration of the individual is exactly like what Sloterdijk said in the Spheres trilogy, where instead of the bubble, so to speak, where everything is kind of circular and everything is unified and whole, now all we have is foam. And foam is just these little mini, tiny atomized bubbles that kind of sit on top of one another but don't make a collective whole. And that's what's happening is every individual has created their own little world, whether it's in online, digitally. Baudrillard, the idea of the simulacrum, his digital avatar is more real than reality. The copy of reality has become more real than reality. We see this in the video games, where you go to your buddy's house and he has the new video game set up, and it's this little cave, ironically, of light. It's almost recreating the cave. Everyone is lost in their own little world. No one, again, no one agrees with on anything or shares anything. We all have our own world, our own imaginations, our own fantasies, and our own beliefs, and that's a big problem. That's a big, 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 big problem. We have no civilizational unity, and as I said in this video and the last video, I truly believe that that will be civilizational death for us. Last one on the perspectival world. Quote, in summary, then, the following picture emerges. There is, on the one hand, anxiety about time and one's powerlessness against it, and on the other, a quote unquote delight resulting from the conquest of space and the attendant expansion of power. There is also the isolation of the individual or group or cultural sphere, as well as the collectivization of the same individuals in interest groups. As more and more people become dissatisfied with the hyper individualism, you are furnishing the preconditions of totalitarian collective ideologies, Nazism, communism. They will be around insofar as libertarianism or this hyper privileging of individualism. You need to find balance. Okay, it's very simple. This tension between anxiety and delight, isolation and collectivization, is the ultimate result of an epoch which has outlived itself. Notice how the anxiety and delight and then isolation and collectivization there, I just realized this, they kind of mirror the antithetical binaries posited by rational thought, as I mentioned earlier. Nevertheless, this epoch could serve as a guarantee that we reach a new quote-unquote target if we could utilize it much as the arrow uses an overtaut bowstring. Yet like the arrow, our epoch must detach itself from the extremes that make possible the tension behind its flight toward the target. Like the arrow on the string, our epoch must find the point where the target is already latently present, the equilibrium between anxiety and delight, isolation and collectivization. Only then can it liberate itself from the deficient unperspectivity and perspectivity and achieve what we shall call, also because of its liberating character, the aperspectival world. The aperspectival world is not unperspectival. It is outside the bounds of perspective, not perspective. Different thing. So that's enough for the perspectival world. I spent more time on that because that's the world we're kind of living in right now. We're kind of living in the aperspectival world, but not really. All right, fine. Now the aperspectival is always going to be a little, it's going to be a little shorter on this one because the aperspectival world is essentially the second half of the book, and I haven't quite gotten there yet. But he says less about it here because that's what he's going to dedicate like 200 pages to it later. So based on, in the same way that, like I said earlier, what differentiated the perspectival world from the unperspectival world was the discovery and higher degree of understanding of space, of perspective. That is what separates. Now, what separates the aperspectival world from the perspectival is time. The aperspectival world has discovered time, really space-time, and I'll explain that later on in videos. And time, as well as space, has been incorporated into the way in which objects in the world are brought into relation with each other. Oh, and he talks a little bit about Picasso. I'm going to show you this picture so you guys can see it. So this is a painting by Picasso, and just like in the other ones, he uses art. Now, art is a great way to make real these changes, these transitions. If you look at Las Meninas by Velázquez and look at some Egyptian painting from 3000 BC, you will understand the difference in perspective. Look that up right now, and you will visually understand, things are becoming more realistic. I understand. Now, if you'll notice, this is not exactly perspectively correct. It's far from it. It's very difficult to even rationally account for this. But he says, yeah, that's the whole point, dude. We've transcended rationality. Rationality is built on space. Now we're in space-time, so you're the one behind. He says, during the recent decades, both Picasso and Braque have painted several works that have been judged, it would seem, from a standpoint which fails to do them justice. As long as we consider a drawing like the one by Picasso reproduced here, in purely aesthetic terms, its multiplicity of line, even when the individual lines appear quote-unquote beautiful in themselves, will seem confusing rather than beautiful. Exactly. It's probably what you thought. That's what I thought when I first saw it. And, as we have been taught to believe, beauty is a traditional category for evaluating a work of art. Yet such pictures or drawings as this demand more of the viewer than aesthetic contemplation based on a criteria of beauty. And the relationship of the two is palpably evident, in German at least, from the previously overlooked root kinship of the word schauen and schauen. Schauen being beautiful and schauen to view, contemplate. Apologize for the mispronunciations. So what's happening here is Picasso has taken a subject, let's say he's painting me. Now, Velázquez or Da Vinci would just paint me, and it would look realistic and it would look accurate in a realistic scientific sense. Picasso says, no, I've discovered time. So I will look at my subject from multiple different perspectives. Think about the time it takes to look at all these different perspectives from different times. from different perspectives, it takes time to walk around and say, here's the front, here's the side, here's the back. Maybe I'll get on the ladder and I'll look down, and maybe I'll look up. He takes all those different perspectives, combines them into an integrated, balanced whole. So we have one person from different perspectives. And yes, it might not be as beautiful, and I don't love Picasso in terms of aesthetic beauty. But it is a new appreciation I have for him, because the same discovery of time that is manifest in his paintings is the same discovery of time that Einstein makes. And I'll be getting to that later in the book. Now, let's see. Uh, Quote, in this drawing, however, space and body have become transparent, which is exactly what the integral consciousness wants to do, and that's exactly what Picasso does. He's integrating different perspectives and all the other into one new painting. In this drawing, however, space and body have become transparent. In this sense, the drawing is neither unperspectival, i.e., a two-dimensional rendering of a surface in which the body is imprisoned, nor is it perspectival, i.e., a three-dimensional visual sector cut out of reality that surrounds the figure with breathing space. The drawing is aperspectival in our sense of the term. Time is no longer spatialized but integrated and concretized as a fourth dimension. That's what integral consciousness is. The no longer spatialized but the integrated and concretized fourth dimension of time. That is what integral conscious structure is trying to achieve. By this means, it renders the whole visible to insight, a whole which becomes visible only because the previously missing component, time, is expressed in an intensified and valid form as the present. It is no longer the moment or the twinkling of the eye, time viewed through the organ of sight as spatialized time, but the pure present, the quintessence, of time that radiates from the drawing. That is what he's doing here. He's incorporating time into his countenance. Now, as far as I can understand, I think I've only kind of just gotten to this part in the book, but Gebser does not like the past, present, future. He does not like that. He views this to be as deficient rational spatialization, right? So we got past, present, hold on, quote now. All right, this might not be the best. So we have the past. Oh, that's not the. We have the past over here. We have the present over here. And then at the triangle, notice the triangular thought, the rational thought, we have the now, in between the past and the present. This takes on a fundamentally spatialized character. There's distance and space between them. Gebser doesn't like that. Gebser says no. Time is a perpetual present in which past and present are unified into the now. With the past and present as antithetical aspects of time, again, antithetical being a fundamental aspect of rational thought. The problem is it gets colored by emotions and biases. People like, for me, example, the past can be cool. I have a lot of good memories, but I'm clinically depressed, and I had a real stretch there when it was a real struggle for me. So that can color my judgment of past. In the future, I always struggle with going into the future. I don't know why. I find it difficult to sort of plan my life. So the problem is the past and future, and when we separate it into antithetical, all these emotions start to bubble up. Gebser says no. Gebser says this is all one. They're all unified in one. Our thoughts of the past, or the past and the present, affect our now, and that is what is perpetual. There you go. That'll be explained more later on. Let's see. Oh, this is important too. So this is explaining more Picasso's integral nature. He said, by drawing on his primitive magic inheritance, his Negroid period, his mythical heritage, his Hellenistic archaistic period, and his classical, rationally extenuated formalist phase, Picasso was able to achieve the concretion of time. Such temporal concretion is not just a basic characteristic of this particular drawing, but is in fact generally valid. Only where time emerges as pure present and is no longer divided into its three phases of past, present, and future is it concrete. Pure present, integrated, unified, not this spatialized one or the other, one causes rational. That's wrong. All right. But I think it was interesting where he said he combined all his previous styles of painting into one. And of course, Picasso, in some sense, is a genius in some sense. People hate him, so it's interesting. All right, now we are at the last. We at the end of the chapter, people. So you won't have to stare at my ugly face for too long, or hear me stumble over words. All right, the very amalgamation of time and the psyche noted earlier, with its unanticipated chaotic effect as manifested by surrealism and later by tachism, clearly demonstrate that we can show the irrational nature of the aperspectival world only if we take particular precautions to prevent aperspectivity from being understood as a mere regression to irrationality. Again, we're not regressing, we're transcending. All you rationalists out there who say, well, you just want us to go back to the time where we ripped hearts out of people and sacrificed them to the gods. That's not what we're saying. So miss me with that. Or as further progression towards rationality. We don't want to go further into the rationality because rationality is driving us off the cliff. We don't want to make a bigger bus that holds more people that can run off the cliff. No, that's death. We don't want to run towards death. Man's inertia and desire for continuity always lead him to categorize the new or novel among familiar lines, or merely as curious variants of the familiar. You have to understand the different structures on their own terms. You cannot rationally try to pick them apart and take your rational box and shove everything in it, even though it won't encompass everything. It just won't work. And he says, let us look again at our example of the fusion of time and the psyche. As long as time is dredged up from the oblivion and thrust into visibility in bits and pieces, our preoccupation with the past aspect of time will bring on further chaos and disintegration. But the moment we are successful, like Picasso, in wresting past quote unquote time that is latently present time from oblivion via its appropriate structure and means of expression and render it visibly anew and thus present, then the importance we accord to the earlier times and their diverse structures of consciousness will become apparent in the development of aperspectivity. So you must adapt or die. That, my friends, and this is all latent within you. It's waiting to be discovered. You just have to put in the work. So that, man, I apologize. I'm new on YouTube. I apologize if this wasn't a perfect explanation. Please leave comments if you guys are confused. I would love to clarify as to the extent that I can. And I really hope you guys follow me in the next series. Let's see. Which will be the next chapter is the four mutations of consciousness. This is big, so we're going to be going through archaic consciousness structure, the magic consciousness structure, the mythical consciousness structure, and the mental, and most likely the integral. In depth, if you were confused by anything I said when I kind of vaguely alluded to how rationality brings objects in the world into relation with each other, this is the meat on the bones. Now we're getting directly into it. We're probably going to do separate videos doing each structure. I don't need if we did all of them, it'd be 4-hour video long. So we'll probably do one on the magic, mythical, and then so on and so forth. So I am super excited. I hope you guys learned a lot. I hope you guys had your mind blown a little bit. And I can't wait to see you guys soon. Thank you guys so much. Be safe, all right?